On May 30th, 2026, 8 days before my sister's wedding, my father looked at me across my parents' kitchen and said, "You can pay for the wedding, but you won't be at it." Gordon said it in front of my mother, Elaine, my sister Sabrina, and two relatives who had come over to discuss the rehearsal dinner. Nobody corrected him. Sabrina kept scrolling through her phone. My Aunt Margaret folded a napkin into smaller and smaller squares. I said nothing. I picked at my purse. My coffee had gone cold beside the fruit bowl. I remember that because I had been holding the cup for nearly 10 minutes without drinking it. What none of them knew was that I had a documented schedule tracing $61,842.17 in estate money and wedding-related payments. I knew which transactions were questioned. I knew which invoices supported them, which ones did not, and where the numbers stopped matching the story I had been given. I did not know yet how far I would take it, but I knew one thing. I had the numbers, but I was not ready to tell them what the numbers meant. Not in that kitchen. Not before I had proof. My name is Mara Bennett. I was 62 when this happened, and for years, I had been the person my family called for fixing. A bill was late. A form was confusing. Someone needed a ride, a loan, or a second look at a number. That was my role. I was good at it. This is Her Silence, where I tell stories about women who spend years carrying what everyone else sets down. I would like to know where these stories are heard from tonight. Houston, London, Toronto, Sydney, or somewhere I have never been. 11 months earlier, everything began. The first bill I remember paying for my family was a $286.41 electricity balance. I was 29, working long hours, and my father said the power company would shut them off if I did not handle it that afternoon. I handled it. After that came a $1,742.68 transmission repair for my mother's car, then Sabrina's $4,316.25 graduate school deposit. Each request arrived with the same explanation. It was temporary. They would make it right. They usually did not. My mother had another phrase for it. Mara is the reliable one. For years, I accepted that sentence as praise. My grandmother's black recipe box helped me understand what it had really meant. It was an old metal box with a loose hinge and a faded red flower on the lid. Inside were recipes, grocery receipts, handwritten shopping lists, and small notes about what things had cost in the 1980s. I had started adding my own receipts when I was in my 20s. Not because anyone asked me to. I simply liked knowing where the money went. The box stayed in my kitchen drawer through 3 apartments and 1 house. By the time Sabrina became engaged, the habit had followed me into my work. I could look at a stack of statements and remember which figures needed another document. There was another reason the family's finances had begun to interest me. My grandmother's estate had been opened more than 15 months earlier. I was one of the beneficiaries. Under Texas law, an interested person could demand a sworn accounting from an independent executor after the required period had passed. I had never planned to use that right against my parents. Until then, I thought the estate was simply another family matter I could help organize. Then I found a receipt that did not belong where it was. It was dated 3 weeks after the estate account opened, and the vendor name was one I recognized from Sabrina's wedding planning. That changed my bookkeeping. The first clue was not a confession. It was a receipt that should never have been inside an estate file. 7 days before the wedding, the requests stopped sounding like favors and started arriving like invoices. First came the photographer. Sabrina needed $2,184.37 by Friday, or the photographer would not release the final album and gallery. My mother called while I was making dinner. She said the money was temporary. I paid it. 3 days later, there was a catering deposit for $3,716.28. This time Elaine said the caterer had changed the payment schedule. Sabrina was already stressed, and my mother did not want her dealing with another problem. I paid that one too. Then came the venue installment. $6,940.63. That was the moment I stopped pretending these were small emergencies. The venue had already received several payments. I asked why another installment had become my responsibility. My father said, "Because you can handle it." I looked at the wedding spreadsheet on my kitchen table. Beside each payment, I wrote the date, amount, vendor, and who had requested it. Family contribution. That was how Elaine described it. The figures looked different. Over 11 months, my personal payments had reached $18,760.42. The wedding kept receiving money. I kept receiving explanations. On May 30th, I asked Elaine for the complete wedding ledger. Not a summary. The actual list of deposits, balances, reimbursements, and payments already made. She stared at me. You don't get a vote in this family. The sentence landed differently this time. I did not argue. I asked one more question. Which account paid the venue? Nobody answered. Outside, a lawnmower passed along the street, loud enough to shake the kitchen window for a few seconds. I went back through the receipts in my black recipe box that night. The paper smelled faintly of old cardboard. I matched each wedding payment to the bank records I had kept. The amounts were not random. Some had familiar dates, familiar descriptions, and familiar initials. I wrote nothing in the margins yet. I simply kept looking at the dates. The wedding was 7 days away. For the first time, I stopped asking what they needed and started asking where the money came from. The dates finally gave me an answer. I pulled the estate statements I was entitled to review as a beneficiary and laid them beside the estate records. I worked from the original statements, not screenshots or summaries. For each payment, I wrote down the date, amount, payee, and stated purpose. Then I looked for the document that was supposed to support it. The first few entries were ordinary. Property taxes, insurance, a storage bill. Then the pattern changed. I found transfers that did not have a clear estate purpose. Some were followed by wedding invoices. Others moved through family accounts before appearing as reimbursements. When I finished the first reconciliation, the questionable amount was $61,842.17. Of that, $14,260.19 could be traced to wedding vendors or reimbursements connected to Sabrina. I checked the figures again. Then I checked them a third time. The problem was not that money had moved between accounts. That happened in legitimate estate administration. The problem was that the supporting records did not explain why estate money was being used for expenses that belonged to Sabrina's wedding. Their language had been family generosity. The statements had another language: dates, payees, transfers, missing support. I knew what I was looking at because this was the kind of pattern I had spent 19 years reconstructing for attorneys. I could not freeze the account or remove anyone from the estate. I could only preserve the records, trace the money, and show where the stated purpose failed legally. By then, my parents still believed I was simply upset about being excluded from the wedding. They did not know I had already found the numbers. I did not confront my mother with a spreadsheet. I made a copy, locked the original evidence away, and called someone whose job was different from mine. The next morning, I called Julian Mercer, a probate attorney whose office was on Westheimer, above a tax firm with a brass directory in the lobby. I told him I was not asking him to take my side. I wanted him to tell me whether the records supported what I thought they showed. Julian asked for the estate statements, the supporting documents, my transaction schedule, and the wedding invoices I had matched to the transfers. He did not react to the total. He opened the first statement and started reading line by line. That helped. I had expected outrage. He gave me questions. Where did this description come from? The executor's ledger. Does the bank statement say that? No. He marked the line with a pencil. For the next hour, we worked through the entries. I showed him how I had matched dates, amounts, payees, and reimbursements. I explained which transactions had clear estate support and which ones did not. I did not label anything fraudulent. I had learned long ago that a missing explanation was a finding, not a verdict. Julian nodded. Your schedule is useful because someone else can reproduce it, he said. That was the distinction I needed. My job did not give me legal authority over the estate. It gave me a method. I could show how each dollar moved and where the documents stopped supporting the stated purpose. Julian could take that evidence into the proper legal process. He pulled up Texas Estates Code Section 404.001 and explained the accounting procedure. Because the estate had passed the required period, an interested person could demand a sworn accounting from an independent executor. The demand had to be made in writing. The executor then had 60 days to comply before the requesting party could seek enforcement in probate court. We prepared the demand that afternoon. My name appeared at the bottom. I read it twice before signing. There was nothing dramatic about the document. No accusation. No threat. Just a request for an accounting of estate property, receipts, disbursements, debts, and property remaining. I mailed it through counsel. Until then, my parents could tell themselves I was angry about a wedding invitation. They could not argue with a document asking them to account for the money. The next document did not ask my parents whether they agreed with me. It asked them to account for the money. The first problem appeared in a statement I had already reviewed. A $7,428.36 transfer seemed to have an explanation. A deposit record showed money coming back into a family-controlled account, close enough to the disputed payment that I stopped and checked the dates again. That mattered. I had promised myself I would not turn an ugly family story into an accusation just because the numbers made me suspicious. Suspicion was not evidence. I needed the transaction trail to survive a second look. I pulled the original bank statement, not the copy in my working file. The transfer left the estate account on April 17th. The description identified a family-controlled account, but it did not identify a wedding expense. Then I found the deposit record. The money had entered that account on April 19th. For a moment, the two entries looked like they balanced. Someone could have argued that the estate money had simply been reimbursed. I checked the supporting invoice. It was for a wedding vendor. I checked the amount, $7,428.36. Then I followed the second account forward. The reimbursement had not returned the money to the estate. It had moved the money between two accounts controlled by the same family. The estate account remained short by exactly the amount I was tracing. I wrote the result in my schedule without using the word fraud. Unsupported transfer. Internal movement. No return to estate. That was enough. I sat at my kitchen table with the black recipe box beside me. I opened it without thinking and ran my thumb over the loose hinge. My grandmother's grocery receipts were still inside. A $23 receipt from a Houston market sat on top of a handwritten recipe for peach cobbler. For years, I had used that box to keep track of little things. Now it held the beginning of a much larger accounting. I checked every wedding-related entry one more time. The questioned amount remained $61,842.17. The portion traceable to wedding vendors or reimbursements connected to Sabrina remained $14,260.19. Nothing had changed because I had wanted a different answer. That was the point. I printed the reconciliation, attached the original statements and supporting documents, and sealed the packet for Julian. I put the packet beside my purse and did not call my mother. She would have wanted an explanation. I had none to give her that would improve the truth. The records had answered the question she kept avoiding, and Saturday was getting closer. 2 days remained until the wedding. I still did not know whether the legal process would stop the next payment. For 1 hour, I thought the whole thing might collapse. Then the second account reconciled, and the answer was worse. The next morning, Julian called to say the filing had been accepted and was moving through the proper probate process. He told me not to create a second dispute at the family gathering. Keep the records where they belonged. Let the documents do their work. I agreed to attend Friday night. I had been told I was not welcome at the wedding, yet I was still expected at the dinner before it. Contradictions were usually treated as manners. Gordon was in a mood when I arrived. He stood near the patio door in a blue shirt, holding a glass of iced tea. Sabrina checked place cards on the dining table. Elaine discussed flowers with my aunt. Nobody mentioned the filing. Gordon looked at me and smiled. So, you finally understand your place. I did not answer. He seemed pleased by that. The old version of me would have explained myself. I would have listed the payments and vendors. I would have tried to make the facts emotionally acceptable. That woman had been useful and tired. I sat at the end of the table and listened while they discussed Saturday's schedule. The ceremony was at 4. Guests were expected by 3:30. The final vendor payments were due before the weekend. 2 days earlier, Those details were problems I needed to solve. That night, they sounded like dates on a calendar. I knew the legal process had moved beyond my parents' control. They did not know that. They still believed the family argument was about whether I would keep paying. Julian had warned me that the process could take time. I did not need an immediate courtroom victory. I needed the records preserved and the accounting addressed through the proper channel. Outside, the patio lights came on as the sky darkened. Sabrina raised her glass and thanked everyone for helping make her wedding possible. I held my water. Nobody noticed that I was no longer included in the word everyone. 2 days became one, and by Friday evening the wedding was no longer waiting for us. The paperwork was waiting for them. The first notice arrived before breakfast. Julian called and said the estate accounting demand had been formally placed before probate counsel. The payment my parents expected from the estate could no longer be treated, without explanation, as another family gift. Every dollar would have to be accounted for. I was not there when they received the notice. I learned later what happened from Julian and from the documents that followed. Gordon called him angry. Elaine called twice. Sabrina sent one message asking whether this meant the wedding was in trouble. Julian gave the same answer to all of them. The records had to be explained. That was the first break in the story they had been telling. The second came when Julian presented my transaction schedule with the supporting bank statements and invoices. The questioned estate disbursements totaled $61,842.17. Of that amount, $14,260.19 was traceable to wedding vendors or reimbursements connected to Sabrina. The figures were not opinions. Each entry had a date, an amount, a payee, and a document beside it. Nora was there when the family discussed the matter that Friday. She had known us for more than 20 years. She had seen me pay the photographer. She had seen me bring checks to my parents' house. She had heard me cancel my own plans because someone else's bill was due. She said quietly, "Mara paid for more of this wedding than anyone wants to admit." Nobody corrected her. That mattered to me. For years, my contribution had existed mostly as favors that disappeared when the next favor arrived. Nora put a witness beside the numbers. Then came the third beat. The probate court's action reached the family through the legal process, not through anything I said. Under Texas law, an independent executor can be removed when the required grounds are established, including misapplication or threatened misapplication of estate property. The process had consequences because the estate was no longer being handled as though the money belonged to whoever needed it most. Gordon's confidence changed first. The wedding had flowers, place cards, a photographer, and guests arriving from 3 states. Sabrina still had her dress hanging in a garment bag. But the money underneath the celebration had become a matter for the estate's records and the court. Nobody shouted. Nobody threw anything. Elaine asked whether the $61,842.17 figure meant they had stolen anything. Julian did not use that word. He said the accounting showed transactions requiring explanation and that the court would determine the legal effect of the records. That answer left Gordon with nowhere useful to go. I did not need to embarrass my father. The documents had already separated what had been paid from what had been promised, and what belonged to the estate from what belonged to a wedding. By Saturday morning, the family could still hold a wedding. They could not quietly pretend I had been the problem. The ceremony could proceed. The accounting could proceed too. Those were separate things now, and nobody at that table could make them the same again. I had spent years making their emergencies disappear. That night, I watched one remain visible. For once, visibility was not my job. Nobody needed me to raise my voice anymore. The documents had already said everything I had spent years swallowing. I finally explained what I had done. There was no reason to make it mysterious anymore. I had not frozen an account. I had not ordered anyone removed. I had followed the numbers. I traced each transaction from the estate account to the receiving account. I matched dates and amounts against bank statements, invoices, and estate records. Then I built a schedule showing where the money went and which payments had no documented estate purpose. Julian used that schedule in the material presented through the probate process. That was my leverage, not my job title, not a threat. The records. I looked at my father across the table. You don't get a vote in this family. He had said it twice before. This time, I let the sentence sit between us. You're right, I said. I don't need a vote. I only needed to stop paying. Nobody answered. For most of my adult life, I had mistaken being dependable for being responsible for everyone. I had thought saying no would make me selfish. Instead, saying yes had made my help invisible. The accounting did something arguing could not. It separated my money from the estate's money. It separated Sabrina's wedding from my obligation to fund it. Most importantly, it separated love from payment. I did not ask my parents to understand me. I stopped giving them something they had come to expect. That was the answer. I had spent 19 years learning that numbers became useful when they could be checked. My family had spent years relying on numbers nobody checked because nobody asked. Now someone had asked, and the answer was on paper. The next morning, I put the recipe box on my kitchen table and began sorting what was mine from what had never been mine to carry. The next morning, I made 5 decisions. First, I stopped making wedding payments. I did not cover the vendor balance or transportation my mother had assumed I would handle. Sabrina's wedding still happened. It simply stopped being financed by my reflex to rescue everyone. Second, the questioned estate transactions moved into formal accounting review. The $61,842.17 schedule stayed attached to the supporting records, where every entry could be checked. I no longer had to explain the same numbers again. Third, Gordon's control over estate property was no longer untouchable. The probate process had its own rules, and the court could remove an executor when legal grounds existed. Whatever happened next belonged to that process, not to my father's temper. Fourth, Sabrina had to face the actual cost of her wedding. She did not lose the ceremony. She lost the assumption that every unpaid balance would eventually reach my bank account. Fifth, Nora kept doing something my family had rarely done. She told the truth about what she had seen. She remembered the checks, the rides, and the bills I had covered. Her confirmation did not create my contribution. It made it visible to someone besides me. I no longer had to prove it to anyone. That afternoon, I opened the black recipe box. The old grocery receipts were still there. So were my handwritten lists from 20 years earlier. I placed the certified probate order on top of them. It was a strange arrangement. Receipts underneath. A legal document above. For years, I had kept that box because I wanted to remember what things cost. Now it reminded me that some costs were never mine to carry. For the first time in my adult life, I could look at a bill without wondering whether love required me to pay it. For years, I thought belonging was something I earned by being useful. I paid, organized, drove, covered, and stayed quiet because that was how my family measured my place. It took one wedding, one set of records, and one refusal to show me the difference. Being loved should never depend on keeping someone else's account balanced. Some doors close when the money stops. That tells me what those doors were worth. If these stories belong beside your evening coffee, subscribe to her silence. There are more quiet women learning to put down what was never theirs. If your love is only valued when it pays, let the bill become someone else's.